This video is brought to you by the Logitech Lightspeed Wireless range of keyboards, mice and headsets, the benchmark in wireless gaming performance.
Is this the next-gen take on The Division 2 we've been waiting for? A new update takes advantage of PS5, Xbox Series S and X hardware with mixed fortunes. Yes, the game still runs via backwards compatibility to existing PS4 and Xbox One code. For now, it's a PS4 app on the PS5 front end, for example, rather than a ground-up PS5 reworking. But developer Massive Entertainment gives us something of a soft support for these new consoles, Back Compat Plus if you like. The headline? All three consoles now run the game at 60 frames per second, lifting the 30 FPS cap on last gen. It feels vastly smoother, of course. That alone is a huge deal, but as a bonus, loading times are improved and there are improvements to the visuals too. The catch? Well, in the process of making this 60 FPS patch, all is not well on PS5 it seems. There are some notable downgrades for the PlayStation version, even compared to PS4 Pro. Key effects are missing in reflections and volumetric fog. So to discuss what on earth is going on here and the ins and outs of each machine, I've invited Alex along for the ride. How's it going?
I'm doing well here, Tom. I covered this game on PC back then, looking at it in comparison to Xbox One X. So it's nice to finally see 60 FPS here being brought to the consoles, where this game plays really well at 60.
Yeah, for sure. We should say it's not the first time we've seen this happen. We've had a Stadia version which has support for 60 FPS as well. So this is following suit, I guess, with higher teraflop specs on each machine, but yeah, there's some complications to this version I think we should get to a bit later.
Yeah.
But for now, shall we rattle through the basics with graphics comparisons, resolutions first off?
Yeah, sure. I guess we can start with Xbox Series S here. Essentially, Xbox Series S has the smallest difference between last gen and current gen, with it targeting 60 FPS, but going for an output resolution of 1920 by 1080, so 1080p. It does have a dynamic resolution setup, which is very typical of this engine, but it can go down to around 900p at the lowest moment that you recorded here in your play. All the versions that we're going to be talking about, though, do take advantage of like a temporal anti-aliasing reconstruction technique that Ubisoft titles tend to take advantage of, and it works pretty well, so you don't actually notice the reductions in resolution all too often. So even though Xbox Series S here will go down to 900p at the worst, it's not as visible as it might be in other games.
So I'll take on the Series X, and Series X is actually 4 times the pixel count, at least maxed out. It's a dynamic 4K, but as with the other versions, obviously that reconstruction typically means you'll see a native 4K image when the image is still. But if you move, you can actually see breakup at points, and you get like drops to about 1800p, so nothing drastic, and actually as a 4K version it runs really well. It's about the same setup as, say, the One X version, which kind of maxed out at 4K but hits that target more consistently.
Yeah, sure. PS5 is a little different though. It's kind of taking over from the Pro here, outputting at 4K and reconstructing with like when you would look to check what the highest resolution was. Essentially, it's like you looking at the sky and playing around with the grass a little bit to get a good count, because otherwise it's pretty hard with this reconstruction technique. And you counted essentially a max resolution of 1890p, so 3360 by 1890, which is, at least on terms of the axis, 87.5% of 4K. The lowest res, though, that you managed to count was 1080p, which is, in general, this is higher, of course, than the PS4 Pro, but it is a bit weird to see the resolution dipping so low on PlayStation 5 when it does come to push. Push comes to shove, as they say.
Yeah, for sure. And I should say also that the measurements we had on the PS4 Pro and One X analysis when we first did that kind of face-off were different. Like on the PS4 Pro, I noted 1944p. And I went back to the Pro version thinking, well, if PS5 is 1890 now, using this sort of looking at the sky with grass in front of the screen to disrupt the reconstruction, then what's going on with Pro? And in Pro's case, it looks like there's possibly been some tweaks on that side because I'm getting 1800p, so it is lower on Pro than PS5. But yeah, all round, if you want the best image, you've got to go with Series X here, but PS5 not too far off the mark when it's like closer to the max target, though PS5 is obviously going for values in between, so on the whole it does look less clear.
Yeah. Another thing to point out too is that there are going to be, at least on Xbox Series X, improvements over the last gen, because Xbox Series X here in this back compatibility mode that it is essentially using to run this version of the game does have what looks to be maxed out 16 times anisotropic filtering. But, you know, doing the back and forth and looking between the versions, it's pretty obvious that this is mainly a performance and resolution upgrade across all consoles, with shadows and textures looking essentially the exact same. I think you did notice slight improvements here in texture pop-in or streaming on the newer consoles, but all in all, really small upgrades next to resolution and performance.
I think the big point though is that there is definitely something wrong with the PlayStation 5 version. So I did our usual side-by-side on both versions, and running through my thoughts as I went through it. Okay, time of day is variable, and also weather states also quite variable. So I'm expecting some differences in these comparisons. There's always like that margin of error in that. But the truth is that there are key settings missing entirely on PlayStation 5 right now anyway. I'm sure this is something that is going to be addressed, or I hope it will be, because it's such an omission that you can't really ignore it. So first up, there's the fog effect, the volumetrics across the game. Anything involving mist, fog, or dust coming from the undersides of lamps, you'll notice this across all the PS5 footage. It's completely stripped out of the game, where it's still there on Series X and S.
Yeah, it's so weird, especially considering the fact that I'm just surprised that this almost made it out the door as a patch with this happening, because, you know, this engine, the original launch of the Division all those years ago, one of the prime effects that they, you know, touted for the engine was volumetric lighting, and it was used really well in the first game with the kind of blizzardy snow effects going around, and in this game a little bit more subtly, I would say just kind of like for morning and early afternoon fog and things like that. But, you know, it being completely gone here really radically alters the image in a way that is not a very positive effect, and it's surprising that it's been released. Yeah.
Another side note, I guess, I mean, that is a big deal in itself, and we'll get back to it, but while this cutscene's running, there's an obvious issue which we've noticed on a number of PS5 titles to this point, which is the black levels being crushed on any dark detail, anything with shadow. You'll notice a lot of detail is being lost on PS5.
Yeah,
so
it's also happening, you know, if you take a system level screenshot, you can see this effect. So it's not in our capture chain or something like that.
Right, so black crush and also the fog effect is missing on PS5. There is one other big catch to running on the PlayStation side, which is reflections. Yeah, this really sticks out. You don't need to match the time of day up too closely to see it. This is night and day, really. Worth noting, there is reflection detail on the ground there, across water bodies, but it's not SSR, is it? It's not screen space reflections.
Yeah, it's just the normal cube maps that SSR, when it can't show up, falls back to. And you can see them kind of fading in and out as you walk across the terrain here. Once again, another kind of, it's not an oversight. Maybe they just launched this because they had to get out in time, but it is a little strange that it launched at all on PlayStation 5, given how massively stripping out reflections really compromises the visuals almost as much as taking out the atmospheric lighting. So it's just another thing where I do wonder what is going on here and why this happened at all, because the PlayStation 5, like, this is definitely a bug, people. PlayStation 5, even in backwards compatibility mode, is more than capable of rendering last-gen effects like volumetric fog and screen space reflections, as you can tell by looking at the PlayStation 4 Pro version, right, Tom?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I thought I'd do that, just nip back just in case it had been dropped out completely from the last-gen version, but no, this is definitely an issue with the code adaptation for PS5. On the left, We've got all those effects enabled on PS4 Pro, and bear in mind this is essentially the same base code. It's just something happened in terms of compatibility, and we're missing these very key effects, and it appears across the game again. Like from the intro, where the time of day is of course matched perfectly, you can see all the mist in the distance there as we emerge with our newly made character completely stripped out, and everything from there onwards, you just don't see anything on PS5. Now, again, I'm very, very sure this will be addressed. For now, it does have a bearing on how the atmosphere comes across. The upshot of all of this is performance. I wonder where we should start. Maybe PS5 is the best place here, because there is some good news.
Yeah, since we're just talking about it right now. Essentially, the PlayStation 5 version, if you take out the fact that it is missing all these effects, it is running by far the best of all the versions that we looked at here. More rarely missing a beat at all in combat scenarios, smooth 60 FPS gameplay for a majority of the time. But there were some moments that you did capture in play that did show that even it looks like some sort of drops can occur in certain combat scenarios, right, Tom?
Yeah, I did a stress test of 5-6 main points in the game. Oh, again, this is all very early stuff. Division 2. One thing it really nails as a game is giving players a lot of options for 4-player co-op, and there's a huge endgame segment as well, and layers upon layers of stuff to add in. But it gives you a kind of cursory look at how generally things are panning out, and so far PS5 has this edge on the other two next-gen platforms, perhaps owing to the fact it's just not running at the same settings, and there's no real parity in that sense. But it is running all these sections a lot smoother. The only area where I've really noticed a drop is perhaps at the start of the first mission, where you see adaptive screen tear being introduced, and that is uniquely PS5 in that the other versions, the Xbox Series S and X versions, are V-synced. So tearing on PS5 here, but you'll rarely see it because frankly it's pretty tightly locked, at least for the first few missions. Whereas if we move to Series X, this is where we see a couple of problems creeping in generally how it plays out at 60, but again, they're not so frequent that it's such a big issue.
Yeah, one of the things that you did capture here in this footage is that when you finish this fight in front of the White House lawn here, that it kind of does this...
Oh yeah, it's the level up.
Yeah, the level up thing. Basically that on PlayStation 5 doesn't dip the frame rate, but interestingly enough does lead to an extended dip on Xbox Series X here, which I do wonder if it is running a little bit too high resolution at times on Xbox Series X, because usually that's what you kind of see what happen in games when there's transparency effects close to the camera. It just means that the resolution is too high, either for the effect itself or, well, the game's resolution is too high at that moment.
Yeah, very true. But in general, again, it's not frequent enough that I could really complain. It's just very obvious when paired next to the heavily stripped out PS5 version that you're seeing, and it's expected as well. I mean, this game is running at a higher max resolution and with SSR and the volumetrics engaged. So, what can you expect?
After this, the next version down on this kind of totem pole that we're talking about is the Xbox Series S version, which tended to show less drops in battles like we would have seen on Xbox Series X, smaller dips in general, so a more stable overall frame rate. But you did manage to capture some sort of bug where like performance dips for a while at a moment when you're kind of not expecting it after dying.
Yeah, so these are moments where you need to retry after a mission, and once you reload back to an area, it's almost like it hasn't buffered enough of the area around you, or just isn't prepared generally, and that causes a momentary couple of seconds drop, but nothing too glaring. You wait a second and it's over, you get back to the action, it's 60 FPS, no problem. In battle, it is better than Series X. I suppose running at 1080p max does help with that, and the settings are overall not as sort of developed as Series X's, but on the whole it's a step up in performance and closer to the 60 FPS line, though not quite up to PS5's level. And of course, you've got SSR and volumetrics in this version, all running properly, so no issues there.
Beyond the performance, though, too, this is a game, in a semi-open world environment, and there is loading into and out of the game and fast traveling. And you did manage to capture some very strange, I would say, data regarding that, Tom.
Yeah, there's a lot of ups and downs to the PS5 version, and unfortunately, this is one of the negative points. Not that it fails to benefit from being a next-gen update, but just not to the extent of the Xbox Series consoles. So I loaded up a new game and for my first test saw Series X boot into the character creation screen first and Series S second, and then by quite a marked margin at 17 seconds on PS5. Still, it beats out the Xbox One X, but it's still showing PS5 isn't tapping into the bandwidth that on paper it should be able to deliver faster loading times than the Xbox consoles.
Yeah, it is pretty strange, and I don't exactly know why this would be happening. Just if you were to theorize about it, maybe, in this backwards compatibility mode that PlayStation 5 has, it's either limited in how much memory it could use at one moment due to the PlayStation 4 Pro, or maybe there's something about the CPU speeds in backwards compatibility mode, but it is noticeably slower than Xbox Series X or even S, which surprises me. So at the end of this all here, looking over all the data that you've collected, Tom, how do you feel about this patch update for all versions of the game?
I think it's quite obvious. 60 FPS is amazing. It is really a huge boost to this game, and it really benefits all round, brings it up to par with, we've had it on Stadia, as I mentioned. Great news. But there's a lot of oddness to go with that on PS5 especially. There's so many pros and cons to that being the best performing version, but having missing effects and the black crush as well, which is kind of inherent in the output of the console right now anyway. So a lot of this, I think, hinges on the moment, where it stands right now, and on PS5 especially, it feels like we're really not digging into what it can do. But yeah, that's about everything really. It's in a nutshell what we've got on this one. We'll tie up there, I think. Thank you so much, Alex, for joining me on this one.
Of course there, Tom.
If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell to get notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch with myself, Alex, or the team, just use Twitter. But from the both of us, thanks for watching.
Finally, a headset that can be as expressive as you. G733 is wireless and designed for comfort, and it's outfitted with all the surround sound, voice filters and advanced lighting you need to look, sound and play with more style than ever. Lightspeed Wireless technology lets you game wirelessly without compromises in latency, connectivity or battery. Play in complete freedom with over 20 hours of battery life and a range of up to 15 meters.